Professor William Saunders from Catholic University of America, and the title of his presentation is Human Rights and the Limits of International Organization. Please.
Okay, I am also an attorney, a lawyer. I'm also an attorney or lawyer, and I have worked at and with some international organizations. So I'm going to speak briefly on two of the best known international organizations in the world, the United Nations and the European Union. First, on the United Nations, the key thing to always keep in mind is that the reason we have the United Nations is because of World War II. This may seem, kind of obvious, but a lot of times people forget it. These are maybe younger people or less attuned to it. But this whole structure we have, international structure, is a reaction to World War II. Remember, we had the League of Nations between World War I and World War II, but the League failed. And the League failed because the United States did not join it, and Russia underwent their change in government, and the Soviet Union only joined it later. And the whole point of the League of Nations was to avoid World War II. Obviously, it was a colossal failure because we had World War II. And World War II was such a devastation. The numbers of people killed there's a wide range, and most of these people are innocent people, so they're not combatants. Something between 50 and 80 million people killed. And then the economies, particularly of Europe, were devastated, leading to the Marshall Plan from the United States after World War II to help the economy of Europe recover, and it's recovered, and it's an engine in the world of economic growth, and it's getting stronger. So the United Nations envisioned, and Churchill and Roosevelt, the head of Great Britain and the head of the United States, were meeting already in 1943 to talk about the shape of the world after World War II, because it was pretty clear that the Allies were going to win, both in Europe and in Asia. And the whole idea was to create a structure, an interaction among nations that would build a system that would be resistant to another devastating world war. And so some other international organizations were created, such as the World Bank and its several parts, so the World Bank system, the International Monetary Fund, also the UNESCO, UNICEF, the WHO, and also the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, which is not quite the same as the others. It was created when a UN trade organization failed, but still, it's one of the institutions created after the Second World War to bring stability, and the idea was that access to resources needed to be available to all nations. There needed to be free trade across, not have trade barriers, so that nations would have a chance, all would have a chance for growth. Common resources needed to be shared in some way, and there needed to be free movement on the seas and other things like this. And then these organizations that were created outside of the UN were in some ways brought back into the UN system as specialized agencies, even though they're independent and they may have been created originally by the UN, but they're independent. But they're brought back in under the UN Charter as something called specialized agencies, so they work with the UN. So we have a system where the United Nations is the primary driver of international cooperation and leading to things or hoping towards things like sustainable growth. And we have now the Sustainable Development Goals, which are to be the world is trying to achieve over the next 15 years by 2030. And the UN has really organized a lot of that. And there's an exhaustive document of this plan, which I just taught in a class in summer school, and it's quite detailed and quite extensive, and it builds on the fact that the World Summit or the Earth Summit in Rio in 1992 did not achieve its goals. And then we had the Millennium Development Goals, which were considered partially successful. So learning from all this, the UN has gone through, there's extensive ideas for cooperation and get what we call buy-in or participation by civil society at every level, from the town to the region to the nation to the international cooperation. It's a very sophisticated plan. We'll wait to see whether it's successful or not, and it tries to put in particular targets and particular goals, like reducing a certain level of poverty to a certain percentage by a certain year, and you measure whether you're achieving your goals by doing that. You have meetings, you've only got 15 years, so you'll have a meeting in 5 years and see where you are, and if you haven't achieved it, there'll be steps adopted by the participants to achieve it. Now, the thing to think of or be aware of in all this is that there's no authority forcing the nations of the world to do this. This is a union of sovereign nations who voluntarily are cooperating with one another. And they could cease to do that. There's nothing that forces them to do this. So, one other aspect of the United Nations system which is central to it, and it's so central that if you look in the Charter of the United Nations, you'll see that the Charter says in order to prevent World War III, we need to recognize and promote the human rights of every person. Governments are obligated to recognize and protect those rights. And that is considered integral to the whole international system. In the 2013 development goals, there's extensive conversation or aspects about human rights. So human rights and development are seen as going together. Now, the fundamental human right document of the most fundamental, the most important, was issued 3 years after the United Nations was formed, and it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it was issued in 1948 unanimously by the General Assembly. And it talks about the first paragraph of the preamble says, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Second paragraph, whereas disregard of these human rights has resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind. So this is right after World War II. The barbarous acts are concentration camps, the experimentation on human subjects without their consent, often lethal to the subject, the intentional targeting of civilians in wartime, the slaughter and destruction of innocent people. So because of that, it's outraged the conscience of mankind. We want to declare, the world at that time in the UN, declared this list of rights. As we talked about in other contexts, what this list lacks is an underlying kind of anthropology explaining it, but this is a list the world issued in '48. Now, I'm a lawyer, like I said, and this declaration is not legally binding, so in order to make it legally binding so that nations were obligated to fulfill it, a series of treaties was proposed by the UN. And I don't know if any of you are lawyers, but so just let me give you just a very brief explanation of the difference. A treaty this is a treaty. It is a written document specifying certain obligations that nations of the world ratify. So if Romania ratifies it, they're bound by it. Now the treaty itself will tell you how you enforce their obligations. But the difference between the Universal Declaration, which is a statement, is that it's not binding in international law as that statement, whereas a treaty, it does create international legal obligations but only between every nation that ratifies it. So a nation that doesn't ratify a treaty is not bound by it. That's very important. So the U.S. has not ratified certain treaties because they do not want to be bound by them. They don't like the treaties. Now we could talk about those, but the main point is if you don't ratify it, you're not bound by it. There are many human rights treaties, but there are two fundamental ones which took the rights in the Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and made them into treaties so they would be legally binding on states that ratified them. One is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and one is the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Again, these covenants list specific rights. So, for instance, I'm looking at the one on the civil and political rights one, and it says no one shall be held in slavery. That's Article 8. Article 7, no one shall be subjected to torture or cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Article 6, every human being has the inherent right to life. Article 9, everyone has the right to liberty and security of person. So there's specified rights. A nation is only bound by what the treaty says. It's not bound by other things that somebody says should have been put in there but were left out. I think this is pretty commonsensical, but you need to grasp it because that is a fundamental point of international law. So we have a convention on economic, social, and cultural rights. And as I said, it's one of the two fundamental, the two basic human rights treaties. Now, this treaty, like every treaty, establishes a committee of experts who are elected by the countries who ratify the treaty. And there's a certain number, it could vary from one treaty to another, but let's say 20. So you elect 20 people. And those 20 people could be anybody. I mean, they could be us, or they could be, a professor of international law somewhere, or they could be, a baker. It's simply an election, and whoever wins the election, I mean, it's usually people who teach international law or something, but it doesn't have to be. Anyway, you've got a committee. So, how do you, under this treaty, try to ensure that nations comply with it? The committee receives a report from the nation, so from Romania or from the US or from the Philippines. Usually every 10 years, it could be lesser than that. And the report says, okay, we're obligated by all these different provisions, and here's what we have done. We, the United States, have done these things. We haven't been able to do these other things. We have some structural obstacles, or there's some problems with this. And then the committee said, and then they have a meeting in New York usually, and the U.S. comes in and discusses its written report. I've been present for those, and the members of the committee ask questions, and the nation answers them, and that's that. So, important fundamental thing to grasp is, this committee does not have the right, it has no power under these treaties to issue a binding interpretation of the meaning of the treaty. It's more like guidance. It can give guidance, but it can't say this absolutely means this or this absolutely doesn't mean this. And it cannot force compliance. So it's more of an advisory body than it is a court. And it's intended to help countries fulfill their obligations. Remember, it's sovereign nations who ratified this. So sovereign nations do not wish to be bossed around by, ordered about by an international organization. They're sovereign. They're happy to receive comments and suggestions, but it's up to the international organization. So that's the way the system is supposed to work. However, let me tell you how the system actually works. And I'm going to take as an example the meetings of the committee under the Economic, Social, and Cultural Treaty in 2015. I'll take an example, a social issue of abortion. I'll explain why I'm doing that in a moment. But so I'm taking abortion. So there were 4 countries that the committee told to liberalize their abortion laws: Uganda, Venezuela, Poland, and Chile. First, the Convention on Economic and Social Rights does not mention the word abortion. It is nowhere in that document. It does say that every human being has the right to life. So this committee, without authority, is telling 4 nations who limit abortion that they must liberalize abortion, even though it has no authority to address that issue. And even though 2 of these countries, Ireland and Chile, are the leading countries in their region with low levels of maternal mortality. Chile bans abortion, has the lowest level of maternal mortality in Latin America. Ireland almost bans abortion. There's a little area if the woman is threatening to kill herself. And they have at least at the time, they had the lowest maternal mortality in Europe. So a committee, which has no right to issue orders, issues orders on a subject on which it has no jurisdiction to sovereign nations to act contrary to their own culture and legal and culture and laws. It does so even though Article 1 of the treaty it's supposed to be helping guide compliance with, even though the treaty itself in Article 1 says every people have the right to self-determination, which includes the right to freely pursue their own economic, social, and cultural development. And that's, even though that, they're telling Ireland, they're telling Chile, they're telling Venezuela, they're telling Uganda, I don't care what your culture says, liberalize abortion. And even though Article 2 of the treaty says states' obligations under this treaty are limited to, quote, ensuring the rights recognized in this treaty. That's it. That's all. That's all the state's obligated to do, and the committee has no business saying anything else. Yet the committee made these 4 sets of orders to these nations, even though the UN Charter, the kind of umbrella under which this whole system of human rights treaties developed, in the preamble says the UN is based upon the equality of nations large and small. So whether you're a powerful nation like Germany or France or USA, or, you know, pick your own example, you don't get to push around smaller, less powerful countries by telling them that they must legalize abortion when their laws and culture are against it. And even though this committee did this, even though the UN Charter in Article 2.7 is the fundamental principle, recognizes the fundamental principle of non-interference in the domestic affairs of states. So the UN system is built upon equality of nations, large or small, and non-interference in the domestic affairs of states. Any treaty must be negotiated and ratified in light of that, and each treaty is going to say in its own articles that the state is only bound by the listed obligations here. So my first point is that, or my conclusion on the United Nations is, even though the United Nations and the United Nations system does many, many great things and has contributed to many wonderful things, like, and by the UN system I mean all these specialized agencies, like, you know, it's led to the elimination of smallpox. It's not, we haven't had World War III. You know, we have economic cooperation. We promote through UNESCO cultural and educational literacy. Even so, in the human rights area, the betrayal of the principles of the United Nations has led to a populist reaction against not only an abuse by one committee under one treaty, but a populist reaction against the entire human rights system. And imperils, that populist reaction imperils the entire human rights project because of the abuse by which bureaucratic international elites have tried to impose an agenda that is not reflected in the human rights documents upon people who have their own views of these matters and which have the right as sovereign nations to live as they please. So second, I'll just say a few words about the European Union. I'm sure that others will say quite a bit. And, but I just want to make a few observations on it. First, there's a book that I read recently, an excellent book called Church of Spies, the Pope's Secret War Against Hitler. And contrary to the calumny that Pope Pius XII cooperated with the Nazis, a calumny created by East German communists to discredit the Catholic Church. Anyway, this book shows that Pius XII went to tremendous efforts to defeat Hitler. One of the things that I noticed in the book, though, was that you could see the growing determination among those who were resisting Hitler to build a world in which you wouldn't have another Hitler. And their view, various people in the book who would become leaders after the Second World War, their view was that extreme nationalism was the cause of World War II. So many of these leaders longed for Europe that would be characterized by greater cooperation and less nationalism. In a series of treaties, the Paris Treaty, the Rome Treaty, and the Maastricht Treaty, we began the process first with the coal and steel community, and then to the common market, and then to the common European citizenship and the euro, an ever-growing cooperation among the countries of Europe, which has surely yielded many benefits. But for the European Union project to continue is kind of at a crossroads. In order for the euro, I can tell my own situation when I've been in Europe and when I haven't been, the euro's value is, strength is weakening. Most leaders think you need more financial and economic integration, which means more political integration. Maybe even to a European superstate. Yet, the two facts that confront us are Brexit, as has already been discussed, where you have one nation pulling out of the European Union, and movements in many other countries considering pulling out of the European Union. And number two, that popular support for the EU among citizens in member states has weakened dramatically. It was around 80% in 1990, and it's down to about 60% today. So it's a 20% drop. So only about 60% of citizens in these countries look favorably upon the EU. Now, why is that? Well, there are many reasons, I'm sure, but some of them, two of them I can think of. One of them is that some of these leaders, these great men like Schumann and Monet, indicated in writings that they wanted the project of European integration to proceed to a superstate or a United Nation, the United States of Europe, but they wished to do it, I would almost say, by stealth. I'm not a scholar of all these materials, but I've read some of them, because they feared that ordinary nationalistic Europeans wouldn't want a superstate. So you start with a cooperation on coal and steel, then you have a common market, then you have EU citizenship and the euro, and the next step is greater integration takes you pretty close to the superstate. And I think, frankly, if that had been the goal all along, it should have been articulated and offered to people all along. And I think some people, well, by the numbers I just showed you, don't wish for greater political integration or even greater economic integration. And the second reason, I think, is that the EU is in some trouble, because some European elites and institutions, even though they're not necessarily technically part of the European Union, but they affect the attitudes, have to do with a kind of imposition of values on nations. As you know, the Council of Europe is different from the European Union, and they have their own treaties, but the Council of Europe has the European Court of Human Rights, which is supposed to enforce this treaty, the Convention on Human Rights for Europe. And in a case I was involved in 2010 called ABC versus Ireland, again, this European court considered Ireland again, a nation whose culture and laws severely limit abortion. And although it did not require Ireland to legalize abortion, it did require Ireland to put in place legal procedures that opened it a little bit in Ireland. It caused the conversation to continue, and it put pressure on the Irish government, which may result in a referendum, and Ireland may change its law. But my point is, the European Court of Human Rights should have stayed out of that issue, but they put their nose into that issue because they have a view. Look, the argument in that case was there is a consensus in Europe in favor of abortion. Now, I suppose by consensus they mean, and you might be part of this, you might be part of this, but I assume they mean most nations favor. There are only 3 countries in Europe at the time that didn't have any abortion, at least I think in the Council of Europe anyway, which was Malta, Poland, and Ireland. But my simple rejoinder to that is, so what? Who cares if there's a consensus? You have a treaty ratified by a sovereign nation who does not permit abortion. There is supposed to be a legal doctrine called the margin of appreciation by which social issues are left to the member states, because the treaty doesn't talk about abortion. So what difference does it make if Germany, France, Britain favor abortion, if Poland, Ireland, and Malta don't? So the whole argument that a consensus should overturn a national cultural position is, to me, totally contrary to the treaties and to the whole human rights project. So I think my conclusion on the EU is that it is in a lot of trouble. It may move towards greater integration, or it may, I mean, there are theories, and you probably know well, about how you could have kind of circles within the EU of more integrated and less integrated, and maybe something like that will be achievable. But I think that if there's a legitimate populist response against international institutions that seek to impose on a nation's culture and laws values that that nation does not share and has not given away in a treaty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Saunders. Indeed, we have a very weak representation of what is international arena on this aspect of organizations. So they are what we are getting from media